Assalamu alaikum, friends. Today we have Dr. Muhammad Ali Ehsan with us. He's teaching at different universities in Karachi. He's been author of several books as well, particularly on Eurasian region, and he also recently authored a book on the Ukraine conflict. So our our conversation starts with the Ukraine conflict. Thank you very much, Dr. Ehsan, for joining us. And the first question I would like to ask you, whether the simmering Ukraine conflict is likely to pan out, extend into another regional, if not a global conflict involving other countries as well.
Thank you very much, sir, for inviting me. It is always a great pleasure to be on your program. The question that you have asked, I think we have to go back to history to kind of understand why things that we imagined would not happen did happen. And if we talk of World War I, people were pretty much comfortable in the way, a great war ended, and they thought that such devastation would never again take place. And 20 years time from that, we had another great war. If personally you ask me, sir, the way that President Putin has been provoked, because I look at it from that angle, in the way that, sir, you can easily divide Russia's borders. They are very important to Russia. Like borders are very important to China also, because both of them are land powers, and we understand that. And both of them are almost landlocked in the way that they cannot really project their power and get out into the oceans as comfortably as US can. So if you look at Russia, it's the Baltic region, the three states there, then Belarus and Ukraine, and then you get into the Caucasus and you have Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. So very simple, straight border. But these two, Belarus and Ukraine, have been the countries that Putin have been time and again asking, please don't mess up here. These have to remain neutral. We need buffer. We need to stay away from the NATO encroachment. We don't want you to come and sit on our borders. And we know that this has been his point of view. But now that it has happened, position of being part of NATO, so the things are not really coming up well. And if you ask me, I would just quote the recent example of how President Biden was there in Ukraine, and he gave a statement. Most of the time that the statements come from the presidents of US, they are very provocative, in a sense that he stood up there and he said that Ukraine has won, democracy has won, we have won. That kind of a statement. It only shows that the president, and he announced $0.5 billion, $500 million of aid to Ukraine, military aid. So the more weapons are pumped in, which is your question, the more strong positions that the European Union countries and the Americans take on this issue, the more, so there are chances. For me, as far as President Putin is concerned, I think he's looking to a long stalemated war. Even in his very, last week address to the nation, he spoke about how we are going to move forward step by step. And the Americans are now worried about the great spring offensive that might be coming. And when I am reminded of the spring offensive of the Americans and their worries, sir, I go back to Afghanistan. And people like us who are following international relations, you're reminded of how many spring offenses the Americans were worried about there. And again, you're hearing the same story now. I think constitutionally, Donbass region, Donetsk, Luhansk, other states, Putin has declared them as his own, his portion of Russians that are there. And I don't know when this is going to happen physically and how much time is going to take. As we know of how Putin does it, I think he's not going to hold back. And if there is no way of getting onto the negotiating table, it will become difficult, sir.
Yeah, I mean, this is one perspective that people don't hear a lot in Pakistan as well as elsewhere, that this is basically an eastward expansion of NATO, and this is how Russia looked at it, whereas the Americans and other NATO allies would like to project it as an attack on a sovereign country, as an attack on democracy. And that's why President Biden has been talking about the victory of democracy at the back of jet fighters and tanks. But when we talk about this, is there a chance of any negotiation? China has recently proposed a conflict resolution mechanism, a formula. So, do you think this may find resonance among the Western countries in the medium term?
Sir, I think both countries have their insecurities. Ukraine has its insecurities. Russia has its great insecurities in terms of how it doesn't want its the areas of influence where its sphere of influence is. It doesn't want the outside powers to come and interfere there. So as long as we are not ready to talk about those insecurities, I think whether China or anybody else, somebody has to make sure that these states can sit together and talk about these insecurities and try and find out a solution. Because, sir, it is not how democracy has won, like Biden said, and how Ukraine has won. We must look at the cost that you pay at the end for the victory that you achieve. So there's a great cost being paid by Ukraine. And I don't know why the European countries do not, although there is a sense of how there are certain countries that are talking about it and how supply of weapons and making sure that the Ukrainians stand and fight. It's eventually going to end. We call war as an act of politics. In the end, sir, it all settles down on the negotiating table. The more you talk about its political part of the war earlier, the more chances are that the less destruction will take place.
Mm-hmm.
And
But this is
the
like
hope is, sir,
this is like this geopolitical alliance, the NATO, and being part of this alliance, the European countries seem to have paid a massive price in terms of energy, the way the crisis has uh, panned out in most of the European countries. But as you are wondering why European countries are just tagging along, as presumably this is just because of the geopolitical considerations. Nobody wants to say no to what the United States want. But then this also takes us to the other question. Can it have its shadow on Indo-China relations? Because China and India have taken a different position on Ukraine, but still there's a huge difference between the two, as India is the preferred baby of the United States, preferred partner in the region, whereas China remains the villain.
So that's a very interesting, I think, equation that is built up in how, if you look at the position that the Indians have taken on the Ukraine war and you look at the position the Chinese have taken. My concern has always been that the mistake that the Western world is doing is that it is always looking at China like we have the Chinese Communist Party. The emphasis of the West is always to look at the communist part of the Chinese Communist Party and not the Chinese part. And why I say that, sir, that it's got 3,000 years of civilization, and it is only in the last 30 years that China has come up and done things that have never happened before in the life of the Chinese. And we know it has been said many times now that how 700 million people have been brought over the poverty line. But China has succeeded and managed to do what other nations have not been able to do in the last 30 years. And that's a great position for a rising power to take or speak about. The other things that I would say in terms of how India has now pretty much gone into the American orbit, to the American bloc, in terms of how it has a defense and strategic agreement with it, in how in all the Asia Pacific agreements or treaties that are there, it is joining them, whether it is AUKUS or whether it is Quad or whichever agreement. But simultaneously, sir, because it has got so much Russian and previously Soviet Union, it's so much dependence of its military, so that it cannot really get out of that.
So, Ehsan sir, a lot of people are talking about the escalation of this Ukraine conflict into extended neighborhood. If it does happen, as are the fears being expressed everywhere, then who will be primarily responsible for this?
So there is a short answer to that, and the short answer to that is I think the West is responsible in how they had no business, I think, to come all over the place, all across, and meddle into the affairs, internal affairs of the countries that were there. That were the great powers we're talking about, Russia and China. But so my great concern is it is not only Ukraine war that is going on, but it is how the line of actual control is actually now live. Almost the entire line of actual control, if you ask me, both the Indians and the Chinese are now, they have to put up such a show that they are able to dominate the other party on all across the line of control. Because if there is weakness anywhere, things might come to a point where the other would try and take benefit of that. So the issues is not only they are in Ukraine, but we have this simmering issue going on here, which we are not really looking at it from the point of view of how it can escalate and boil down to, this is how it happened in the world wars when it happened. So we
Mhm.
have issues, sir. We have our region is the most nuclearized region. Five nuclear powers here. A lot of hegemonic tussle in how who's going to be the hegemon. We had the regional hegemons within the place, and now we have the external hegemon, the global hegemon coming in with its pivot Asia policy, Asia Pacific. And when it comes in here, there has got to be a situation where either it has to be a conflict prone engagement between these great powers or cooperation on the basis of cooperation.
Mhm.
But the more you look at it, and the more the indications are that maybe it has got to be something to do with conflict, escalating and things not getting better.
Yeah, but is there a likelihood of a real flare up between China and India, given the situation, the air of animosity between the West and China right now?
Sir, I think you know it better that it has always been balance of power in how the relationships of the countries have been maintained. States have maintained their relationship through the concept of the balance of power. And when we talk about the relationship between China and India, India has, not only has a good strategic and defense partnership with the Americans, it is also maintaining a very neutral position and a very neutral relationship with the other power in the region, which is the Russians. So I think they will continue to act as on behalf of Americans in the region to fight for their interests, and China pretty much knows that. And China would also, sir, continue to reassert itself like the way it is doing in South China Sea. I think if we look at China, it has got about border with 19 countries in the world. So that's a huge border that it shares with different countries and with different kinds of threats it has to face. And not only the borders, the land borders we're talking about, we're talking about the coastal its coastal borders also. So South China Sea primarily, and primarily the Malacca Straits, where the Indians have their positions, where they Andaman Islands and other places where they control them. If it comes to that point where we all know that it's like 70% of their energy is passing through there, the Malacca Strait going into the eastern China region. So if these things start happening, the Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Straits, the Indian Oceans, bays, other things, sir, things can turn around and really become difficult geopolitically. They all have geopolitical implications. As small little skirmishes that we don't look at very threatening, they might boil up and create circumstances where the superpower, the external power, along with the powers in the region, might get involved, and we might have a difficult situation.
Hmm. So if we look at the way the American and other regional its allies forces are spread out, particularly in the South China Sea area and around it. So don't you think that there's already massive squeeze on China's marine access routes through the South China Sea? It's like already surrounded.
Sir, I look at it differently. If you look at the South China Sea, it's the 9 dash line. Now it has become 10 dash line that the Chinese have drawn, and the 10 dash line clearly has taken away all the EEZs of the neighboring countries. So we already have a conflictual situation, whether it's Vietnam, whether it is Philippines, whether it is Malaysia, whether it is Indonesia. All these countries had access about 200 nautical miles ahead of their coastline, which have all now come within the 9 dash line. It is not only the presence in on the water body, it is the air above also. So the China has really claimed both, and both the sovereignty here of these countries and their claims. So we already have a conflictual situation. What China has as a grave problem is its access to the Western Pacific.
Mhm.
And for that, sir, I always relate it in history in how uh, America could only come and dominate the Eastern Hemisphere because it could dominate the Western Hemisphere. And it dominated the Western Hemisphere because President Roosevelt indulged into that great negotiation of having all the bases that belonged to the British Empire. He took away that, and gave them used destroyers, 50, 60 destroyers under a deal. So America pretty much camped itself in the Western Hemisphere, and then when it has had an issue also of moving from Atlantic to Pacific, and that again is a great example in how it went to Colombia in the early 20th century, and we have how the history how it went in and took constructed the Panama Canal, and there it took away the province of Colombia and almost declared it an independent country
Mhm.
until 20 I think almost the start of this century. It was laying claim to that, and utilized it as a great resource to enter into the Pacific and through the western part. So America has also been doing in the past whatever suited its strategy, whatever suited it in becoming a great power, sir. And what we need to recognize is that there is this great opportunity now with the Chinese, who are there's a great discussion going on whether they would replace them as the future power, the global hegemon. But I do think, like it has happened before in history, first you delegitimize a country, and then there is the second phase that starts, which is the transition of power phase. So as far as China is concerned, we are looking at a delegitimizing phase where China is accused of all the human rights violations. China is accused of all the wrong ways of debt trapping the countries in Africa, in Asia. Its BRI not looked as something which would favor the world. So it is a digital legitimizing phase through which China is going. All powers went through that phase. Even the Germans went through that phase. And that phase, when it gets over, then the next phase starts, which is the transition of power phase, which is what China would ultimately do. There's this great example that Henry Kissinger has given in his book on China, and that is how the Americans are playing the game of chess, in which you are always in a hurry to kill the king. But
Mhm.
the Chinese are playing the game of Wiki, which is something I don't know what kind of game it is, but it says that what you do is you create enough resources and circumstances and situations where you gradually assert yourself and come in a great position to topple your enemy after you've taken your time and have been patient about that. I think that pretty much qualifies China and how it is dealing the world, and how America is in a great hurry, to solve the Ukrainian problem, to solve the Chinese problem, to do everything that it thinks it must do.
Well, that's an excellent analogy, Dr. Hassan, you have drawn on how Dr. Henry Kissinger looks at the Chinese policy right now, and how he basically is looking at the hurry that the American establishment seems to be in. And you're very right. It's the delegitimizing phase in which China is being accused of all sorts of human rights violations, particularly the Western Xinjiang province is in the line of fire. But interestingly, the Americans and other European its allies are simply looking away from what has happened in India, for instance, on the same front, massive human rights violations, particularly vis-a-vis the Muslims and Christians of India. But hardly has any government officially formally spoken about those violations, just because India is the preferred strategic partner of all these countries. And that is what actually defines the geopolitical interest, that if something suits your geopolitical interests, then however bad that may be, you like to embrace it. And it was a very good tutorial, Dr. Hassan, also in how the American influence has been expanding right and left. So thank you very much for this interesting and inspiring story, and hope to be in touch again with you on similar exciting lectures.